January 1945. A chaotic staging area in the snow-covered Ardennes forest. Artillery fire shakes the frozen pine trees while American infantrymen scramble through the freezing mud, ducking for cover. Amidst the explosions, several soldiers look around desperately for guidance, but they see no officers. Every helmet is thick with frozen slime, and every jacket is completely bare. Nearby, 3 wounded men bleed into the white snow because nobody could find a leader to authorize an immediate retreat or call in supporting artillery. The officers are hiding right in plain sight, having intentionally disguised themselves as regular privates. They believe this clever deception keeps them safe from German snipers hiding in the tree line. They are about to discover that General George Patton has a very different view of battlefield survival. His response to this hidden leadership will force these men to face the ultimate price of their deception. This is the story of when Patton punished junior officers for using modern camouflage violations to hide their rank from their own troops. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when old hierarchies met new realities. Sergeant Paul "Paulie" Rizzo was 30 years old, hailing from a gritty, working-class neighborhood in Newark, New Jersey. He belonged to the 318th Infantry Regiment of the 80th Infantry Division, a unit that had been battered relentlessly by the winter elements and German resistance. Rizzo had enlisted immediately after Pearl Harbor, leaving behind a young wife and a steady job at a local machine shop. He was a veteran of the Normandy hedgerows, a man who had seen his original platoon dwindle down to just a handful of familiar faces. His body bore the scars of shrapnel from a mortar blast outside Metz, a wound that still throbbed whenever the freezing winter air settled into his bones. He knew his men, he knew their fears, and he knew that survival on the front lines depended entirely on clear, decisive direction. During the sudden, brutal German skirmish in the Ardennes, Rizzo found himself screaming into the freezing wind for an officer to authorize an artillery strike. But his desperate cries went completely unanswered. Lieutenant Carl "Smitty" Smith was 25 years old, arriving on the front lines from a comfortable upbringing in sunny Pasadena, California. He commanded a platoon within the same regiment, carrying himself with the unearned privilege of a university graduate who had breezed through officer candidate school without ever seeing true violence. Smith considered himself a modern tactical genius, a forward-thinking intellect who viewed traditional military discipline as a collection of outdated, suicidal nonsense. He wore a tailored wool coat beneath his field gear, and his personal kit included a luxury silver shaving set sent from home, which he used daily to keep his face perfectly smooth despite the freezing field conditions. Smith believed that the Army's visibility rules were a death sentence designed by old men who did not understand the lethality of modern snipers. When the German artillery began to fall, he immediately stripped the silver bars from his collar and smeared thick, freezing mud over his pristine winter uniform. The overall situation across the European theater in January 1945 had reached a point of absolute, frozen desperation. The German army had launched a massive, surprise counteroffensive through the heavily forested Ardennes region, catching the Allied High Command completely off guard. This brutal winter assault, which became known as the Battle of the Bulge, created a dangerous wedge in the Allied lines, fracturing communications and isolating entire units in sub-zero temperatures. Deep snowdrifts made basic supply transportation nearly impossible, leaving forward infantry battalions low on ammunition, dry rations, and medical supplies. In this environment of extreme chaos, many conventional Army regulations simply collapsed as units fought purely to survive the night. Junior officers in various regiments began taking liberties with their uniforms, looking for any possible advantage against an unforgiving enemy. Many commanding officers chose to look the other way, letting these minor infractions slide because they believed the harsh conditions justified a breakdown in standard military protocol. They reasoned that keeping men alive was more important than checking for proper collar brass or inspecting the cleanliness of helmets. This lenient attitude created a dangerous precedent, allowing a culture of loose discipline to infect the frontline ranks without consequence. It became commonplace for leaders to prioritize practical concealment over the rigid visibility requirements outlined in Army manuals. But this widespread laxity created a fatal disconnect on the battlefield, where the clear identification of leadership was the only thing preventing total annihilation. The small staging area in the dense, snow-covered forest was about to become the epicenter of a harsh lesson in basic military command. The smoke from the German skirmish was still clearing when the cost of this tactical breakdown became painfully visible to the entire battalion. January 1945, a chaotic staging area in the snow-covered Ardennes forest. Artillery fire shakes the frozen pine trees, throwing heavy white powder over dozens of shivering American infantrymen. The men crouch in deep, muddy foxholes, gripped by panic as German shells tear through the branches above them. They are completely pinned down, desperate for someone to organize a withdrawal or call in defensive artillery fire. Yet, when they look around the perimeter for leadership, they see nothing but an endless sea of identical, muddy helmets and plain wool coats. Every man looks exactly like a low-ranking private. The junior officers have completely erased their own identity. They believe they are outsmarting the enemy snipers by stripping away their authority. General George S. Patton will teach these hidden leaders a lesson in visibility they will never forget, forcing them to stand out in the deadliest way possible. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top Jeep roared into the snow-covered staging area, throwing a spray of gray slush over the frozen pine logs. 4 silver stars gleamed brilliantly from the front of his polished helmet. His custom ivory-handled revolvers rested in their leather holsters against his thigh. He stepped out of the vehicle into the freezing mud, his tall frame rigid and immaculate, despite the bitter Ardennes winter. Every man in the vicinity immediately snapped to attention, frozen in place by his sheer presence. The general did not raise his voice. His eyes scanned the messy perimeter, looking past the wreckage of the skirmish until they locked directly onto the dirty group of junior officers standing near the edge of the tree line. Patton walked slowly across the frozen ground, his boots crunching in the deep snow. He stopped directly in front of the lieutenant, studying the mud-covered helmet and the blank collar where the silver insignia belonged. "Lieutenant, where are your bars?" Patton asked. "I took them off for the engagement, sir," Smith answered, his voice tight as he tried to maintain a confident posture. "And why did you do that?" the general asked, his tone deceptively flat. "To deny the enemy a high-value target, sir," Smith said. "It provided a tactical advantage. A dead officer cannot lead his men in a firefight." Patton did not blink. His eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at the young lieutenant. "You think you are a modern tactical genius," he said. "You altered your uniform and hid your rank from the enemy, but you also hid it from your own men when they needed you the most. You sat in the mud to save your own skin while your squad looked for a leader to save their lives. Sergeant Rizzo had to do your job because you were too cowardly to be seen. You forgot that leadership requires visibility, no matter the cost." The general stepped closer, his voice cutting through the freezing wind. "I am giving you and your fellow officers a binary choice right now," Patton said. "You will either face an immediate court-martial for cowardice and altering a uniform in a combat zone, or you will accept a field correction. You will paint massive, bright white officer stripes across the back of your helmets. Then, you will personally walk point at the absolute front of the next 3 infantry patrols. Decide your fate in the next 10 seconds. Smith looked at the cold, unyielding face of the general, his mouth dry. He realized his military career was over if he chose the court-martial. The young officer swallowed hard, his arrogance entirely shattered in front of his surviving platoon. "We will take the paint, sir," Smith whispered. January 1945. A chaotic staging area in the snow-covered Ardennes forest. 3 American soldiers lie dead on the frozen ground, their boots sticking out from under coarse wool blankets. Nearby, a group of infantrymen stare in absolute silence at a row of helmets sitting on a wooden crate. The steel pots are heavily caked in frozen mud and wrapped in white cloth. The silver bars of leadership are missing, scrubbed away by the very men ordered to wear them. A young lieutenant stands over the crate, adjusting a blank, mud-smeared helmet. He believes he has outsmarted the battlefield. He believes he has saved his own skin by vanishing into the crowd, but his choice just cost 3 men their lives. General Patton is already on his way to this clearing, and his response will redefine what it means to lead under fire. The price for hiding from the enemy will be a devastating obligation to be seen. The cold wind of January 1945 cuts through a chaotic staging area in the snow-covered Ardennes forest, where artillery smoke hangs low over the frozen pines. Muddy trucks idle as exhausted American soldiers prepare to move back toward the front line. Suddenly, a sudden, brutal German skirmish shatters the tree line, pinning an entire platoon down in a ditch under heavy machine gun fire. Mortar rounds erupt around the freezing infantrymen as they look frantically for anyone in command to call in defensive artillery fire. No silver bars are visible anywhere in the ditch. The men scream for an officer, but find only muddy helmets and blank uniforms hiding in the slush. 3 soldiers die in the snow because their leaders chose to blend into the dirt. General George S. Patton will deal with these invisible commanders by forcing them out into the blinding light. January 1945, a chaotic staging area in the snow-covered Ardennes forest. Artillery fire shakes the frozen earth as American soldiers scramble through the mud, desperately dodging incoming mortar shells. 3 young infantrymen lie motionless in a fresh crater, their bodies covered in gray slush, while their squad mates look around in absolute panic. They are screaming for a leader, searching the faces of the men beside them. But every single man looks exactly the same. No silver bars gleam on any collar, and every helmet is caked in thick, intentional layers of mud and white cloth. The men in charge have erased their own identity to hide from German snipers, leaving their unit leaderless in the darkest hour of the winter advance. General George S. Patton will soon discover this deliberate erasure of authority, and his punishment will force these invisible leaders to become the most visible targets on the entire Western Front. Some historians have argued that General Patton's strict enforcement of uniform regulations during the winter of 1945 was an outdated, rigid obsession with military protocol that ignored the very real lethality of modern German sniper tactics. They claim that forcing officers to remain visible in a meat grinder like the Ardennes was an unnecessary risk to valuable leadership assets. Other historians have argued the exact opposite, insisting that tactical discipline and clear battlefield command are the only things that prevent a tactical retreat from turning into a total slaughter. What is certain is that the visible markings on the helmets of that platoon remain standard practice, a permanent reminder that authority cannot hide when the battle begins. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have allowed the officers to remain camouflaged for their own safety? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about when the price of leadership was the willingness to be seen, make sure to subscribe.